Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Nasia Safdar from Infectious Diseases and Associate Dean for Clinical Trials. Delighted to welcome you all to the session today, Clinical Research Protocol and Data Monitoring. We have two excellent speakers today. We'll start with Kristen Mahaffey, who is a certified clinical research professional with over 14 years of experience in the clinical research field. Her expertise spans a broad spectrum of key operational areas, including regulatory compliance and administration, protocol activation, and study startup, as well as research contracting and finance. She's played a pivotal role in streamlining research processes and ensuring adherence to regulatory standards across various therapeutic areas and study phases. In her current role, Kristen leads a clinical research monitoring team with a specialized focus on supporting investigator-initiated research involving investigational new drugs and investigational device exemption applications. She works closely with investigators to ensure compliance with FDA regulations and good clinical practice guidelines, providing oversight and strategic guidance to help researchers navigate the complex regulatory landscape. She's known for her collaborative leadership style and expansive knowledge of clinical trial operations, and we are delighted to welcome her as one of our speakers today. Our second speaker is Dr. Loren Denlinger, who is the William W. and Judith H. Busse Professor in Allergy and Asthma Research in the Division of Allergy, Pulmonary, and Critical Care Medicine at UW. He's the department's immediate past chair for Clinical and Translational Research. He holds 2 patents, co-chairs the Data Monitoring Committee at the UW ICTR, and is a reviewer for numerous peer-reviewed scientific journals. He has special interests in asthma, bronchiectasis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and is a medical director for the UW Health Advanced Asthma Care Clinic. Both of our speakers have a wealth of experience, so please use this time that they have generously given to us to ask your questions in the Q&A. And at this point, I will turn it over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Dr. Safdar. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My portion of the presentation is going to cover protocol monitoring. I'm going to provide some important definitions, lay out the purpose of monitoring, as well as go over how to create an effective monitoring plan. I will also touch on identifying noncompliance and do a special highlight on adverse event reporting. So my first focus will be to define the roles of study teams who are required to conduct monitoring, and that includes a sponsor and a sponsor investigator. And a sponsor is defined as a person who initiates or takes responsibility for a clinical investigation. And this can be an institution, an individual, or a company. The sponsor only conducts the investigation if they are considered a sponsor investigator. And this means that they would wear both hats of the sponsor of initiating the trial and the investigator conducting the trial. And if a person or company is using its employees to conduct the investigation, the person or company is the sponsor, and the employees are investigators. So a sponsor investigator is defined as an individual who both initiates and conducts the investigation. The term only refers to an individual and cannot be a company or institution as a whole. So, for example, UW cannot be a sponsor investigator, but Dr. X employed by UW can be the sponsor investigator. And the sponsor investigator must follow requirements of both the sponsor and investigator. So what are the monitoring requirements of a sponsor? Sponsors must monitor the conduct of clinical trials performed under an IND or IDE application. A sponsor may transfer or delegate responsibilities and tasks to monitors qualified by training, experience, and education, but the ultimate responsibility always resides with the sponsor. So the sponsor can delegate, but is always ultimately responsible. And then this brings us to the definition of monitoring. So here we have the official definition. Monitoring is the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial, ensuring it is conducted in accordance with the protocol and regulatory requirements. It can be done on-site, remotely, or a combination of both. Basically, monitoring is assessing and assuring compliance with the study protocol on an ongoing basis. And monitoring consists of periodic site visits. Again, these can be either in person or remotely. During these visits, monitors will ensure the following. The FDA regulations and GCP guidelines are being followed. Subject safety and rights are being protected. Overall adherence to the protocol, drug and device accountability. The case report form data can be verified from source documentation, and that each subject has signed the informed consent form. So in a nutshell, the purpose of monitoring is to ensure that the rights and well-being of human subjects are protected. The reported trial data is accurate, complete, and verifiable from source documents, and the overall conduct of the trial is compliant. So in order to conduct all that monitoring that we just discussed, we need a monitoring plan. A monitoring plan is a document that describes the strategy, methods, responsibilities, and requirements for monitoring the trial. The sponsor is responsible for developing a specific monitoring plan to the risks of the trial. So each trial should have its own unique monitoring plan. And when developing a monitoring plan, unfortunately, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And also, unfortunately, the FDA doesn't spell out monitoring frequencies or overhaul requirements of monitoring. So it's up to the sponsor to assess which risks to reduce and which risks to accept. And this is known as risk-based monitoring. And when CMS develops a monitoring plan, that's my department, we utilize a risk scoring tool specific to each study. And that helps us determine how much and how often to monitor. So an effective monitoring plan should lay out the following elements: the scope, or what will be monitored, the extent, how much will be monitored, the frequency, how often will the monitors be there, the type of visit, why are the monitors there. In central monitoring service, we have 3 different types of visits that we do. The first one is the site initiation visit, and that is at the beginning of the study, before subjects are enrolled, but after IRB approval. And this is to ensure that everyone has been adequately trained on the protocol, all the regulatory documents are in order, and the study is ready to start enrolling. Entering monitoring visits are done during the study. This is when at least one subject has been enrolled and has completed 1 or more study visits. These are usually the most common monitoring visits. There's usually more than 1 of these, whereas there's only 1 site initiation visit. And then the closeout visit is done at the end of the study. This is when the last participant has completed all study visits, but prior to IRB closeout. And we want this done before IRB closeout in case we find anything that's reportable. Otherwise, you would have to open up the study all over again and to report it, and no one wants to do that. And again, this closeout visits, there's only 1 of those conducted per study. And lastly, the monitoring plan should include an overall communication plan. So who the monitors will communicate with regarding the findings. With Central Monitoring Service, we do monitoring confirmations. So we let study teams know ahead of time in a letter what will be monitored. We outline which subjects will be monitored. We can convey that we'll do regulatory, any drug accountability. And then when we're done with that monitoring, we send out monitoring reports, and those outline any findings we have. And then we expect the study team to follow up with any response to those findings. So let's say you're a sponsor. You now know what monitoring is. You have a monitoring plan in place, and it's time for the first monitoring visit. And the monitor identifies some areas of noncompliance. What should you do? So if the noncompliance significantly affects the subject population or data integrity, the sponsor should perform a root cause analysis and possibly implement corrective and preventive actions. If the monitoring uncovers continuing noncompliance with a specific investigator, The sponsor should consider terminating that investigator's participation in the trial and notify any applicable regulatory authorities. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and cover adverse events. The definition of an adverse event, or AE as we call them, is any untoward medical occurrence in a clinical investigation participant administered a study product or medical device. The AE does not necessarily have to have a causal relationship with the product. So for example, if someone on the study gets in a car accident while participating in a clinical trial, that could potentially be considered an adverse event. So recording adverse events in a study is very important. As monitors, we like to see the following category documented for all adverse events. The date the adverse event was reported to the study team, and this can be self-reported by the participant, or it could come from medical records such as a recent hospitalization. We need to see a description of the event, start and end dates if applicable, the outcome of the adverse event, for example, if it's ongoing, is it resolved, etc. The grade or severity of the adverse event, the seriousness, expectedness, was it included in the informed consent form, the IB or the protocol, the category of the adverse event, the treatment the participant received, and any action taken. Were they removed from the study? Was the study drug paused for a while? Anything like that. So you'll also need to make a determination if the adverse event is related to participation in the trial. And for that, we have the following categories. Probably related, that is likely due to the drug or device. Possibly related. It's unknown for sure if it's due to the drug or device, but it can't be completely ruled out. And not related, and that's clearly not due to the use of the drug or device. And AEs are graded in terms of mild, moderate, or severe. Mild means that the event is noticeable to the participant, does not necessarily impede daily activities, and does not require medical intervention. Moderate means that the event could influence daily activities, and the intervention may be needed. Severe, the event causes severe discomfort and interferes with daily activities. Treatment or medical intervention is usually required in those cases. In addition to AEs, we have serious adverse events. And these are defined as any untoward medical occurrence that results in death, is life-threatening, requires hospitalization, results in a disability, causes a birth defect, or requires intervention to prevent any of the above outcomes. And a serious adverse event has specific reporting requirements. So if it is serious, unexpected, and related to the study intervention, it needs to be reported to the FDA within 15 calendar days and to the HSIRB within 14 business days. That's if you're using UW's IRB. If you're using a different IRB, that could be completely different reporting requirements. If it is fatal or life-threatening, unexpected and related, it needs to be reported within 7 calendar days to the FDA and 1 business day to the HSIRB. Others involved with protocol management should also be informed. That includes ICTR DMC or Central Monitoring Service. And then serious adverse events that are not considered reportable should still be documented, and appropriate staff should still be informed. And then overall, as monitors, we see a lot of various compliance issues across the institution. But these next couple of slides will list out the most common findings. So we tend to see inadequate documentation of informed consent. This means that the wrong consent version was signed, or subjects did not reconsent as required by a protocol amendment. Inadequate baseline medical history to help us determine true eligibility. inconsistencies between study documents. One of our jobs as monitors is to make sure that the source matches what's entered in the CRF forms or case report forms and whatever database they're using. Sometimes that's REDCap, sometimes that's metadata. Wherever that's entered, we want to make sure it matches the source. And source can be medical records. Anytime, wherever the first location that is documented is the source. So it can be a case report form if that is the first place that it's documented. And sometimes we see situations where different subjects have different forms for the same visit, which just kind of makes the research look a little sloppy, because overall you want each participant to have the exact same experience throughout the study, unless there's been a protocol amendment or change that would cause a different form to need to be filled out. Another thing we see is the inability to maintain regulatory records. That includes the delegation of authority log, who's assigned to do what task on the study, training logs, and just so you know, a new training log should be completed with every protocol amendment. Any staff that is affected by that protocol amendment needs to be trained on what those changes are to their study task. CVs and medical licenses, at UW, we like to see those updated, the CVs every 2 years and medical licenses as those get updated by the state. And then more common mistakes, we see inadequate supervision of study staff, insufficient investigator involvement. I was involved with a study where an investigator tried to delegate the site initiation visit to another study personnel, which kind of just showed right off the bat that investigator was not going to be a very active investigator throughout the study. Inappropriate delegation of study tasks to unqualified persons. I saw an example of a non-medical personnel assigned medication administration, which was not appropriate. So just make sure that as an investigator, if you're assigning someone to a task, that they have the adequate training, education experience to conduct that task. We've seen failure to adequately protect subject or research subjects, and overworked staff with too many research projects. At my previous institution, I worked with an investigator who had over 90 studies that she was a principal investigator on. In my opinion, that was too much. In her opinion, she could have done more. And with that, so this slide highlights Central Monitoring Service data from 2022 to 2024. We have both regulatory findings and participant findings separated out here. And as you can see, the most common regulatory finding involves study personnel. So that's those training logs, delegation logs, delegation logs, CVs, medical licenses, everything. And a lot of that is just because study personnel fluctuates. You know, people leave the study team, people join the study team, and that just needs to be kept up on an ongoing basis. And that's really hard sometimes when there's a lot of turnover. And then the most common participant finding is that data management. That can just be anything from typos, from data, you know, from the source document into the database, to just not having the correct data. A lot of times that includes missing data as well. As you can see, the second most common regulatory finding is IRB submissions and correspondence, you know, not notifying the IRB adequately when changes need to be made to this protocol. Adverse events, inappropriate documentation of adverse events. A lot of times we see investigators not signing off in a timely manner on adverse events. And then the informed consent as well, having subjects sign the incorrect version of the informed consent, or not having them reconsent if required by a protocol amendment. And that concludes my presentation that I have presented. Are there any questions?
Great, thank you very much, Kristen.
Oops.
Just check the chat. seeing any questions at the moment. So I will turn it over to Loren for his talk, and as people are thinking, go ahead and post your questions and Kristen can address them after.
So maybe before I get going, thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm glad that we could do this together with Kristen. So an internal note, Teresa, I am in my office, so I think I can drive the slides.
Okay, sounds good.
So let me just try that out. So. Sorry about that. Give me a moment here. All right. I should be showing the presentation mode, hopefully.
Yes, we can see that.
All right, excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'll dive right in. I will confess up front, I'm leaning on my experience. I've been part of this committee as a member since 2011 and co-chair, the clinical co-chair since 2016. I'm in the middle of clinic today, so I'm a bit distracted. So hopefully that doesn't show in my presentation, but we'll see. There we go. All right. So what is a data monitoring board? Real simply, it is also known as a DSMB or data safety monitoring board. There's two basic types, and that's internal or external. An external group would refers to actually both of them refer to the sponsor. So occasionally a sponsor will host their own data and safety monitoring board. But depending on the size of the trial, particularly smaller trials, often they'll require this to be done outside of the sponsorship. And that can be in the form of an institutional committee like the one that we'll describe, or through a group of investigators that are outside of the study team. So the membership almost always includes a statistician or several statisticians, depending on the size, but also having clinicians with expertise in related areas relative to the study that's being monitored. And then, as I mentioned, our Institute for Clinical and Translational Research has a data monitoring committee that we've run for many years now with diverse specialty representation, as well as conflict of interest policy and confidentiality policy, which are all things that investigators and sponsors like to hear. So what does a DMC do? So we start off by reviewing the protocol before, ideally before things get launched, but sometimes shortly thereafter. And it's mainly to make sure that we have a good sense of what's the intended sample size, what's the expected rate of accrual, what are the study stopping rules, both for individual participants as well as for the study, what are the expected adverse events, and can we help the team with setting up their forms correctly so we get our reports right. Once things get going, we'll review the progress of recruitment on an annual basis or semi-annual or even quarterly, depending on the speed, the anticipated speed, and the acuity of the patient population. And sometimes this is also driven by the sponsor needs. When we have our meetings, the first thing that we review is data quality, and what I mean by that primarily is the quality of the data coming to our report. So all of those visit calendar information complete, so that we have a really robust sense that the study team has been doing all the things that Kristen just talked about in terms of documentation and reporting. And then we'll also review safety outcomes. And so keeping track of those on a weekly basis certainly helps getting ready for these committee meetings. And then occasionally, if requested by the sponsor or the investigator team, we'll also review the primary endpoint data for futility assessment. In those cases, that's often built into the statistical analysis plan up front because there is a statistical quote unquote cost or penalty to doing that. So it's not something that all studies do. So when would a team need to think about a data monitoring board? So, certainly this is sometimes driven by the sponsor. Often when it is driven by the sponsor for big studies in particular, they'll have an internal DSMB, but they may say you should look, locally to find one yourself. Sometimes the IRB will recommend this, and for full clarity, our data monitoring committee through the ICTR here is a subsidiary of IRB, so we report directly to the IRB from that oversight perspective. We do have a decision-making tool or chart to review, and the website for that is listed here. I'll go through it briefly on the next two slides. So internally at ICTR, we feel that a data monitoring committee should be required if any of the following conditions apply. So if the trial is intended to provide clinically useful information about effectiveness or safety of a medical or a device-related intervention. Often those studies are monitored by the sponsor, but sometimes not. And then certainly if there's suggestion that the intervention might be risky in some ways, or if you have a high-risk study population, such that any even slight signal of risk might be useful to stop things early, just to promote the overall safety of this population at risk. We feel that studies that have oversight by the FDA highly benefit from having a data monitoring committee, and so that's listed here in the required category. And then other high-risk criteria, kind of alluded to previously, relate to risk of the intervention or risk of the study population. And then certainly anytime you have a blinded study, that always raises the possibility of, is there secondary gain? And so a DMC can help assure that the blinding process is indeed valid, to assure that the interpretation of the results is with minimal bias. So there's a few conditions where we don't feel that a DMC is required, but could be recommended. And those typically involve interventions or study populations with less risk. But for example, if you have a large study that's phase 3, that's not monitored by the sponsor, that would certainly be a possibility. Or a multi-center study, regardless of the phase, certainly helps to keep the accrual information up to speed for all the other partnering sites. So I'll let you go through those with the online link. So what kind of data does the DMC review? As I mentioned previously, we're very interested in the accrual rate. Can the study team recruit the patient population that they are intending to study in the amount of time that they want to do so? So we are really interested in the start of the protocol and the end of the funding period, for lack of a better word, to help us anchor a graph that will show how well the team is doing relative to the expected rate. The data quality I mentioned, this is related to filling out those reports in REDCap or Encore, so that we have a sense of patient flow and we don't have any missingness in any of those report entries. So we'll also look at the demographics of the recruited patient population. That helps us, especially in trials where there's randomization. This is one of the things that helps us assure that the randomization is intact. And then the AE reports we'll certainly pay attention to, especially anytime there's a death on a study or a serious adverse event. Those are called out for special review. And then if requested by the study team or the sponsor, we can do a futility analysis if we have access to the primary endpoint data. So often we're asked, should I contact the data monitoring committee if there's an adverse event, and what types of events should we contact the DMC for? And we often will refer teams back to their own protocol, because we'll spell this out, up front with them in that initial review. But usually it's in line with the decision tree provided by the IRB in terms of, what's the level of seriousness of the event, and depending on, the level of care that's needed, that leads to different timelines for reporting. And this tool is available online through the IRB site, but I just show it for reminder to teams to use that when this question comes up. So what doesn't the data monitoring committee do? So, we don't have enough information to really adjudicate any of the study endpoints that are suspect. So if we're not sure that things are, how should I say, possible, if there's an outlier, for example, we won't really be able to do that without, diving in further. And that may be one of the reasons why we ask the team to speak with a monitor who will actually work, hand in hand with the study team, get access to the charts, for example, the study charts, and really review, is there suspicion for why, a given endpoint might be an outlier. So we won't be responsible for reviewing all adverse events individually as they accrue. So routine adverse events are reported at the frequency of our meetings, and even SAEs, if they are not, if the study team is confident that they're not related to the study participation, perhaps they're related more to the underlying disease comorbidity, then a special meeting of the DMC is usually not required. And then we also are not part of the primary analysis team. And so once the data are unblinded, so to speak, that is really the job of the primary statistical team, and not necessarily our data monitoring committee. So some best practices. Contact us early is a good place to start. Even when you're just starting to write your grant, knowing that the grant writing process is lengthy, the earlier we get involved, the better you can have your human subjects protection section for your grant fleshed out. But it also helps us help the study teams with thinking about stopping rules and other important parameters that sometimes are overlooked. And then we'd like to see the protocol before it goes to the IRB. That's not an absolute requirement, but certainly it can be helpful. both for the team and for the committee. It would minimize having to send a change of protocol to the IRB if there's something that is felt to be missing, so to speak. Make sure to include study stopping rules, both for the individual participant, as well as for the study overall. And that the study overall kind of makes the team reflect back on what's the overall morbidity of the study population. Is this a young, healthy study population, or are the individuals that will be studied, frail or at risk for other reasons? And if they are frail or at risk, maybe they'll have to go to the ER or the hospital for routine care. And if you have information about how often that happens, using that in your study stopping rule can be helpful. If indeed you have an SAE the first time around, if we know that it might be more likely to be due to the underlying disease and not the study participation, then it's easier to keep the study going without having to stop enrollment for other participants. And ideally, we'd like to review the protocol before the study participant is enrolled, but that is not a absolute mandatory feature. It certainly can be helpful to get all of our ducks in a row. And then once enrollment does happen, we'll schedule a quick review of the forms and accrual plan, so that will trigger another DMC meeting, which is just to make sure that we have all the forms and dates correct, and that will also then anchor the timing for the follow-up meetings. So once study enrollment has started, we may have a 6-month follow-up or a 12-month follow-up, depending on the needs of the sponsor, for example. So another best practice, and this was kind of alluded to in Kristen's talk as well. So each adverse event should be entered into the recording database ideally within a week of its occurrence, including PI involvement regarding its attribution. That's just a best practice tip, so that you're not scrambling as a study team at the end with a whole bunch of AAs that need to be entered, and then a lot of head scratching retrospectively in terms of what happened or what didn't happen. So that's just a best practice. And keep us posted of SAEs, especially those that might possibly be related. We want to know about those sooner, but that's also in line with the IRB decision tree. So refer back to that decision tree first, and then that will help you in terms of when to let us know as well. And then often, well, with each meeting, there is a memo that summarizes the discussion and says you're good to go for another 6 months, or did we have specific recommendations? And sometimes that requires some follow-up, and it's how should I say? The onus is on the study team to make sure that those items are taken care of. And the lack of that sometimes is cause, if you would, to get a study monitor involved. So I'll just call out a few ICTR resources to help study teams that haven't done this before. So there is a research and protocol development program, and the website link for that, and also a recruitment and retention resource center with informatics help often, so that you can get a sense of how many patients are in UW Health's catchment, for example, for your particular study's entry criteria, but also utilizing the latest and greatest tools. This resource can be extremely helpful for studies that are challenging to recruit. So here's some contact information for the DMCC or DMC. You know, if you need a protocol to be reviewed, we have a consult form on our website. And certainly Teresa is available if you have just general questions prior to a consult. So with that, I'll turn things over to our question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Loren. That was great. Appreciate it. Kristen, there's a question for you from Dr. Kim. Can you explain the difference between monitoring versus auditing?
Yeah, so in my experience, monitoring is an ongoing review of study data, whereas auditing is kind of a single instance. Also, monitoring is kind of between the sponsor and investigator, where those are the individuals involved with any of the reports. Whereas with auditing, it might go to like someone at a more higher institutional level, or for example, FDA audits. And again, that's like a one-time audit versus monitoring, which is ongoing. Did that help
Very much.
explain?
Yeah, and also, you know, one could view monitoring as a way to stay ready for an audit.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it as well.
So that readiness piece is important. Okay, so let's see if people have other questions, either for Loren or for Kristen. Kelly Miller says, do DMC members serve a specific length of time? Do you bring on specific ad hoc members for specific studies? Loren, this is for you.
Yes and yes. So we tend to have 3-year terms for our data monitoring committee members. We're certainly, you know, always interested in bringing new people on. Those terms can be renewed if there's interest. And some of our members have served for many terms. So, but at least we give folks the opt-out option if they want to move on to some other task 3 years later. And then as to the ad hoc membership, yes, that's also true. If there is a complex study design that has an intervention or some other aspect that is outside of our wheelhouse from a specialty standpoint, then we have worked with ad hoc committee members, and we'll certainly work with the study team if that is a question or concern.
Thank you. Amy asks, is an expanded access protocol typically sponsored by the drug manufacturer when the investigator considered a sponsor investigator? Or what do you think about that?
I think that depends. If it's like an orphan drug, typically that goes directly through the FDA, and then the investigator would be considered the sponsor investigator. But if it has like a drug manufacturer that is actually doing these, it can be where they're the sponsor.
Thank you. Other questions? This is a really wonderful time we have with our speakers. Is the focus of both groups mainly drug device studies, or do you work with SBE studies as well? I'm assuming the B is behavioral. I don't know what the other. Maggie, you could come off mute to ask that question if you want.
Well, certainly in the data monitoring committee, we have a growing portfolio of studies that don't involve a device or a drug per se. So, you know, a decision tool, you know, that's been spun out into an app of some kind is one example that I can think of recently. Behavioral, you know, interventions. So cognitive therapy, for example, is something we have a few protocols on. So yes, it's not restricted to drug and device.
For CMS, we typically, sorry, for CMS,
no, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So for CMS, we typically only review drug device studies. But those can include non-significant risk studies, but they have to be clinical trials with drug and device of some sort.
Thank you. Kristen, would you like to take the next one?
Yeah, so the CTMS, we monitor studies that we're contracted for. So an investigator will reach out for us to monitor. My understanding is that the PAM teams kind of do audits of any study, and that can include the behavioral studies as well as some clinical research studies. Our focus is more GCP research as well.
Check the chat. All right, last call for questions, folks.
So Kristen, this is Amy Redemel, just to follow up on that. Are you saying that the PAM is more of like an auditing function?
That's my understanding. And
Okay.
they also don't do ongoing monitoring like we do.
Yeah.
They'll do like a one-time review.
Thanks.
Loren, this is a question for you. What do you suggest including in study stopping rules if you're working on a study that isn't looking at interim monitoring based on outcomes?
Is that in the chat? Let me look at
Yeah,
the text here.
sorry, it was a complicated question,
Yeah.
but a really important one.
You're working on a study that isn't looking at. Well, so I guess so if an individual participant on the study has an SAE, so they have to go to the ER or to the hospital, and it's unclear whether, say it's possibly related to the study participation. It may have happened within a day or two of a visit or something like that. Is that something that we'd expect based on, the comorbid disease? Say they have, unstable, heart failure or something like that. And, they have been going to the ER periodically. Having a base sort of event rate of complications disclosed in the protocol can help inform us in terms of how should I say, cautiously we need to react the first time an SAE occurs that might be related to the protocol. Do we, continue to collect more information, or do we need to stop enrollment while we figure things out with the study team?
Thank you. All right, let's just take a look here. I think that is it for the questions. I want to thank our two speakers today for their time and their expertise. Thank you so much, Kristen and Loren. Oh, wait, there's one more question. Does CMS offer any help with setting up a monitoring plan for a study that would not actually engage with the clinical monitoring service for the monitoring?
I mean, we would run it through our risk analysis, and it would be up to you to contract with us once we run that, the numbers.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining and for the great participation. See you all later.
Thank you.
Bye.